In 1944, deep within the Japanese mainland, during the heart of a freezing winter, Marine Sergeant James Holloway was dragged into the prison camp yard. He had been caught with a small slip of paper, a ration list his group secretly used to distribute food to the sick. To the Japanese guards, this was an unforgivable offense. They tied his hands, forced him to kneel on the frozen ground, and struck him with rifle butts across his back and face heavy, blood-soaked blows. His screams fell on deaf ears. Yet Holloway kept a calm gaze. He did not cry out, did not beg for mercy. Only 3 words came from his lips. "Hold the line." An old saying from his company back in Guadalcanal, now an invisible shield against brutality. He didn't fight back with fists, but with an unshakable belief in honor and the men beside him. Holloway was one of tens of thousands of American soldiers imprisoned in Japanese POW camps during World War II, places where forced labor and iron discipline replaced any notion of humanity. Yet, amidst violence, hunger, and bitter cold, what allowed them to survive? What held them back from crossing the line between despair and death? Sergeant James Holloway was far from an isolated case. Throughout the war, thousands of American prisoners like him were sent to infamous detention camps across Japan, places where a soldier's honor was tested not by bullets, but by hunger, beatings, and years of unbroken silence. Among these, Ōmori Camp, built on an artificial island in Tokyo Bay, stood as a stark symbol of the harshness and cruelty with which Japan treated Western POWs. In name, Ōmori was labeled a re-education camp. In reality, it was a cluster of crude, tin-roofed barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Most of the prisoners were Americans, held not simply for containment, but to be broken both in body and spirit. They were viewed as disgraced men, soldiers who had failed to die in battle. To the Japanese warrior code, surrender was a shameful act. Each day began before sunrise. There were no bugles, no official wake-up call, only the heavy thud of boots on wooden floors and the sharp bark of a guard. Up! Outside! Work! Groups of prisoners trudged out of their barracks into the biting cold or blistering heat, heading for the Tokyo docks. Work shifts lasted more than 12 hours, hauling sacks of rice, crates of ammunition, stacking coal, pushing heavy wooden carts with bare shoulders and bare hands, without gloves, without protection. Those too weak to bear the load, or too slow to keep pace, were beaten down without hesitation. Meals consisted of a single bowl of rice mixed with gravel, sometimes accompanied by a bit of bitter boiled vegetable soup. Each day's food was just barely enough to keep from blacking out. Those too sick to get out of bed were still forced to work or were left to starve so that the portion could go to someone more useful. Every few days, another man died from exhaustion, from disease, or simply from a kick to the head after collapsing during labor. Holloway once recalled, "At first, I counted how many died each week, but by the 7th month, I stopped. Not because I forgot, but because I couldn't bear to remember another name." The guards at Ōmori didn't just use fists. They used organized silence to break prisoners' will. No talking aloud, no keeping family photos, no letters, no newspapers, no news. Some prisoners lost control, screaming into the night from the crushing sense of being erased from the outside world. Some cried. Some quietly ended their lives, with ropes braided from scraps of cloth. For Holloway, the only source of strength was the men around him. He didn't speak much Japanese, wasn't stronger than the younger soldiers, but he held on to his spirit. He gave up his rice to sick prisoners. He quietly passed on sayings like, "Hold the line," not to urge others to fight, but to remind them they were still soldiers. One evening, as the prisoners huddled after a work shift, a young soldier pulled from his boot a small piece of paper, drawn in charcoal, showing a map of America home. No one said a word, but in their eyes was something that couldn't be extinguished: hope. Holloway looked around and nodded. If we still have hope, we're still alive. Ōmori was not a place designed for survival. It was built to break people. But right there, in that very place, men like Holloway stood up not with fists, but with discipline, memory, and brotherhood. In the next part, We will explore what helped them preserve their lives and their humanity through more than 3 years of hell. At Ōmori, prisoners survived more on sharing than on food. In each gritty rice portion, few could even taste anything. What remained in their mouths was silence, and sometimes the dryness in their throats from not having had even a single cup of clean water all day. The stronger ones, often young Marines, found ways to hide a bit of their ration in their sleeve or in a rolled-up flap of their shirt, to secretly pass it to the sick bunkmate next to them. These gestures came without words. Just a glance and a small nod was enough. "I see you. I won't leave you behind." What got them up each morning wasn't the food, it was memory and belief. Inside the wooden barracks, with rusted tin roofs full of holes, prisoners molded chess pieces out of dirt, sketched the American flag onto a broken piece of wood, and hid it beneath the bed. Some memorized the names of hometown streets from an imagined map. Others carved their wives' and children's names into the inside of their wooden clogs, so that every step was a quiet reminder. Someone out there is waiting. Holloway kept the habit of folding his blanket with sharp corners every morning as if he were still in a Marine barracks. For him, discipline didn't require a uniform. It only took standing up straight to hold on to one's humanity in that place. Outside, the yard was a daily campaign for survival. Prisoners were split into teams and rotated through work at the harbour, warehouses, or ship repair yards. One day, they were ordered to drag a massive steel block across a gravel path. Blood oozed from their hands, but they clenched the rope tighter because the man behind had collapsed. Another day, it rained. The mud reached their knees, the cart slipped, and the whole group was dragged out into the freezing wind for punishment, without a word of explanation. A slap for pausing to breathe. A kick for glancing sideways. In such conditions, help sometimes came from the smallest acts. A hand pulling a friend upright, a whispered arigato in broken Japanese. One prisoner taught his team a few words to navigate danger, how to say water, how to say tired, so the guards might understand instead of hitting. Sometimes, just bowing the right way at the correct angle was enough to avoid a beating. They studied each guard's habits, each glance, each sign of rising tension, to stretch out their survival a little longer. At night, even with their bodies worn to the bone, many sought one another out. In the dark of the barracks, they huddled close, telling stories of home, the car they used to drive, the name of a favorite diner, or music playing from the radio back in San Diego. They rebuilt America with words, piecing memories together like a roof for the soul. Some mouthed poetry even in sleep. Others clutched scraps of cloth torn from a shirt sleeve, still faintly inked with a wife's name. Holloway, even after having 2 ribs broken when shielding a fellow prisoner, still pulled himself up each morning. He was the one who passed out food before eating himself. The one who gave the warmer corner of the wall to a younger man just arrived at the camp. He was the first to step forward when the guards asked for a team leader to translate the day's orders, not because he spoke Japanese, but because he knew what would happen if no one did. Through it all, Holloway lived as if still commanding his squad at Guadalcanal, only now, the battlefield was darkness, and the only weapon left was dignity. Ōmori was built to make men fall, yet there were those who would not bow. They didn't fight back with fists, but with each extra day they endured. By holding on to the smallest things, a straight posture, a promise to save part of a meal for a friend, or simply washing their hands before eating even when there was no soap, they didn't survive by chance. They endured because they did the one thing their captors hadn't foreseen. They chose to hold on to each other, one by one. Amid a life that had rotted under barbed wire and mud, what kept American prisoners standing was not luck or chance. They endured because each man found his own anchor, and from there, connected himself to a small but unbreakable brotherhood, a community of former soldiers surviving in hell while holding on to their spirit. Comradeship was the lifeline that ran through every barracks. At Ōmori, every soldier entered the camp alone, but soon after, each found himself part of a survival team. Sometimes it was just 2 men. Other times it was a small group. They took turns watching over each other at night, shared every sip of water, every handful of rice, even a single pair of wooden clogs. One young soldier was bedridden with fever, and his rations were about to be cut because he could no longer work. That night, Holloway broke his rice portion in half. Then another man followed suit. By morning, the food was just enough for the sick man to open his eyes and sit up. He still couldn't stand, but something had changed in his eyes. In the thick air reeking of sweat and illness, sometimes a small gesture like that was all it took to keep someone tethered to life. Military discipline continued quietly, even when uniforms had been stripped away, ranks erased, and all orders now came from the barrel of a gun. Some former officers reorganized their men, assigning work based on individual skills. One man handled medical care, another taught languages, another told stories late into the night to help others forget their hunger. Some sculpted chess pieces out of dirt, while others wrote poems using broken charcoal on splintered wood. These acts, seemingly trivial, helped preserve a sense of shared purpose. The camp was no longer just a place of confinement, it became a silent front line where prisoners fought together in their own way. They did it with loyalty, quiet care, and whispered encouragements in the dark. That sense of unity became an invisible shield, helping many endure through the most brutal years. Post-war statistics revealed something striking. While 41% of U.S. Army soldiers died in Japanese captivity, only 23% of Marines suffered the same fate. The difference wasn't in food rations or living conditions, but in the culture of the unit itself. Among the Marines, every man was a link in a chain, and the chain was held together by the promise that no one would be left behind. That difference, when placed in a setting of despair, became a true survival advantage. Beneath that quiet discipline and brotherhood flowed a current of silent resistance. American prisoners, many of them seasoned soldiers, refused to become mindless laborers. Some drew maps in reverse to mislead construction crews. Others tampered with cement mixtures to sabotage enemy infrastructure. On one occasion, a warship at the Mitsubishi shipyard sank right after launch. The prisoner who had welded a key joint simply smiled to himself when the news reached the barracks. In Ōmori, resistance came not only from physical endurance, but also from the quiet defiance of spirit and humor. On a winter night near the end of the year, the camp stirred with unusual energy. A group of prisoners had spent weeks preparing a silent play, a simple story of a soldier and a nurse, staged with scraps of cloth, tin cans, and a few brooms as props. Laughter erupted across the camp, even from the Japanese guards. What they didn't realize was that the second half of the play parodied a Japanese officer unknowingly eating rat meat, believing it was chicken. That night's laughter gave the prisoners a better night's sleep than any meal could have. Alongside collective strength, each prisoner had to sharpen a personal weapon, survival skills. Those who knew how to sew turned fish bones into needles and scraps of fabric into thread, repairing clothing to survive the cold. Those with hunting experience set traps near the latrines, supplementing their diets with anything still living inside the camp. Others, with some medical knowledge, chewed bitter leaves to wash wounds, applied clay to swollen blisters, and used fly larvae to clean pus from infections. One nurse saved a man's life by using maggots to draw rot from a festering leg wound. These primitive methods, though makeshift, carried many through what had seemed unsurvivable. Faith, too, became a kind of medicine. On long, damp nights, prisoners would hum "Silent Night" in English, gathered in small circles, eyes closed, imagining a wife's hand, a mother's face, or the warm kitchen hearth of home. Some clung to scraps of paper bearing verses from the Bible, wrapped in candle wax to keep dry. Others whispered a prayer each morning before heading to the docks, not in search of miracles, but to remind themselves that a part of their soul still remained untouched. In the camp's darkness, those spiritual sparks became the final refuge of hope. Each man found his own way to hold on. Some leaned on discipline, others believed in God. Some held on for a promise made to a friend. Others simply lived for the hope carried in a whisper from a homemade radio. Allied forces have retaken Guam. That news passed quietly from group to group. And each time it did, a little more fire returned to the will to live. All of these things, camaraderie, silent organization, adaptability, and faith, wove together into a kind of spiritual immune system. It was this that kept American soldiers from being broken in a place built to crush them. And so, when the gates of the camp finally swung open, many men emerged not just alive, but still clear-eyed enough to remember, to speak, and to never forget what had happened behind those barbed wire fences. August 1945. All of Japan fell silent beneath mushroom-shaped clouds. The 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had brought an abrupt end to an empire that once roared across the Pacific with pride. On August 15, from a radio speaker placed within the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed for the first time across the nation, a quiet, solemn tone declaring unconditional surrender. Across the prisoner of war camps scattered throughout Japan, time seemed to stop. News of the war's end struck like lightning on a clear day. In an instant, forced labor ceased. Guards who once barked orders now moved silently, some packing up gear, others vanishing into the night. The next morning, prisoners awoke to scenes they could hardly believe: baskets of clean clothes, bags of medicine, rolls of toilet paper, and even loaves of bread laid neatly in the center of camp. Items once deemed luxuries suddenly appeared as if left behind in apology by a defeated enemy. Ernest Norquist, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, sat on a rotting bunk at Ōmori Camp, clutching an unopened packet of biscuits. He whispered, "Maybe they're trying to gather one last bit of kindness to wash away all those ruthless years." There was no hatred in his voice, only astonishment at how swiftly everything had changed. A prisoner at Hitachi wept when he saw an Allied plane swoop low over the camp, its pilot waving from the cockpit. 3 years and 8 months had stretched longer than a lifetime, and somehow he was still alive. There was no time to waste. Liberation of the camps had to begin immediately. The Allied command launched Operation Birdcage. Millions of leaflets were dropped over prison compounds with a simple message: the war is over. Paint PW in large letters on the roof and await rescue. Each fluttering piece of paper was a key unlocking the psychological cage that had imprisoned these soldiers in despair. Shaking hands picked them up. Tearful eyes read and reread the message, afraid the dream might dissolve. Then came Operation Swift Mercy. Over the next 3 weeks, from late August to the 20th of September, 1945, hundreds of B-17 and B-29 bombers from Guam, Okinawa, and the Philippines flew new missions, not to wage war, but to deliver life. Some 4,500 tons of food, medicine, clothing, letters, and chocolate rained down on camps stretching from Japan to Southeast Asia. These supply storms created scenes never witnessed before. At Naoetsu Camp, former Olympic runner Louis Zamparini watched fellow prisoners scatter wildly as crates plummeted from the sky. Some were struck and injured, but no one complained. Inside were cans of meat, candy, canvas shoes, caps, and gifts from home. From those parachutes, prisoners cut fabric to sew warm blankets, patch torn clothing, or stitch together flags of the Allied nations. In makeshift independence celebrations, prisoners clasped hands, waving their silk flag high as cheers rang out, mouths still chewing dry biscuits. Those first days of freedom felt like a festival without end. Yet the joy remained incomplete until American troops arrived in person. On August 29, the gates of Ōmori Camp officially opened from the direction of the bay. A fleet of U.S. Navy landing crafts, carrying officers and sailors, quietly approached the prison island. As the American flag fluttered at the bow, the prisoners rushed to the shore, waving and shouting like a storm had broken loose. Some dove into the water to swim out, despite just recovering from dysentery. Others threw off their shirts and raised their arms in joy. War correspondent John Swope, sitting on one of the landing crafts, broke into tears as he saw faces hollowed by starvation, beards overgrown, eyes dazed yet shimmering with faith. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "As we neared the shore, they rushed to embrace every single one of us. A young soldier collapsed into my arms, mumbling something in broken English. I have never seen such fierce will to live." Within a few hours, all 600 prisoners at Ōmori were transferred to the hospital ship USS Benevolence, anchored offshore. Their wounds were treated, their bodies washed, their stomachs filled, and for the first time in nearly 4 years, they lay on real bedsheets. Other camps across Japan were also liberated in turn. Prisoners in places like Hokkaido and Sendai had to wait longer, but hope had already returned. In less than a month, most surviving American POWs were rescued, marking one of the swiftest and most effective humanitarian operations of World War II. The rescue was a success, but the healing journey was far from over. The skeletal soldiers were brought to recovery centers in Guam or Tokyo. Army medics were shocked to find grown American men weighing barely 35 kilograms, teeth falling out in chunks, fingernails peeling off from malnutrition. After a few weeks, they were given new uniforms, fed proper meals, and finally boarded ships heading home. On deck, the former prisoners sat in silence, staring at the sea, clutching family photographs. Some burst into laughter, some wept uncontrollably, some sat frozen like statues. Back in America, they were welcomed as heroes, but many carried invisible wounds. Some suffered from PTSD for years. Others battled chronic illnesses stemming from their imprisonment. In the decade following the war, their early mortality rate was twice the national average. And yet, most lived on. They built families, wrote books, shared their stories, and kept the vow they had made to one another behind the prison fences. If we survive, we will not let anyone forget. On the 11th of September 1945, a Marine who had been captured in Guam wrote a letter home to his mother. "Mom, our American planes just dropped supplies for us. I ate so much chocolate I fell asleep right after. It feels so good to be an American." Their journey concluded with a radiant chapter of resilience. In the chronicles of war, few stories blend darkness and light so profoundly: cruelty and compassion, hell and hope. These prisoners endured through willpower, faith, and countless small acts that once seemed insignificant but have left behind an indelible lesson for future generations, that as long as people hold on to one another, even in the darkest prison camps, the light of freedom can still find its way through the cracks.